Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tim. Tom, Best. Thanks for having me here. So I'm going to jump right into it and try to maybe talk for 20, 25 minutes, plus or minus, and try to lay out where we've been, how we get here, where we're going to go from here. All right. And then I'm going to try to take plenty of your questions. All right. So let's go back, way back to 2019. It's kind of where this story starts, and it's worth remembering what happened in 2019. Real GDP growth in 2019 was 1.75%. Remember this at all? 1.75%. Remember for the previous 10 years, it's been kind of sluggish. 1.75%, 2%, never above that. And inflation in 2019 was 1.75%. So nominal GDP growth, nominal, which means real GDP plus inflation, was 3.5%. And my one piece of advice I'll give today is from here on after this talk, you might start watching nominal GDP because you'll get a lot of insight from watching that. They don't report it, you have to put it together. But let me explain. So why was real GDP growth so sluggish for the previous 10 years? GDP growth, that is real GDP growth, ex inflation, is the sum of growth in the workforce plus growth in productivity. That's it. Okay. Now, just to give you an idea, in the 70s, when Paul Volcker was famously raising rates, workforce growth in this country was close to 3%, because people like me were aging into the workforce, and many of you were aging into the workforce. We had an enormous demographic tailwind. Okay? Since the 70s, workforce growth has been decelerating little by little every 10 years. Okay, 2 and a fraction in the 80s, less than 2 in the 90s, a little less than that in the 2000 to 2010 area. We are today to the point where workforce growth in this country for the next 10 years is probably going to be between 0 and 0.25%. Okay, now why is it so sluggish? A lot of people say, the young generation, a bunch of moms, they don't like it. No, that's not. I'll say that. I don't see that. That's not the reason. It's aging. I wish we weren't aging, but as big as Gen X and Gen Z and Gen Y are, they're not big enough to offset the retirement of the baby boom generation. All right? And the reality is women are working and are more fully represented in the workforce than ever before. People are working longer in their careers than ever before. Unfortunately, lots of people are dropping out of high school to enter the workforce, which we saw in the last jobs report. And even with all that, the participation rate is still stuck at 62.8% or so. We just can't go up. Why? Because in the next 10 years, people will continue aging out of the workforce. This is why immigration, legal immigration, is so critical if we're going to grow the workforce. But what's the point of this whole thing? There's a reason why we're not growing faster. Workforce growth is near 0. So all of our growth for the next 10 years and for the last 10 years is basically had to come from productivity growth. And investment in technology and AI and all that stuff is great. But you got to remember, a big slug of our workforce has a high school education or less and works in the service sector. And it is very difficult in some parts of the service sector to use technology to improve productivity. So my own view as I sit here today, the potential of the U.S. economy over the next 10 years, unless we get some pleasant productivity boost up, is maybe 1.75%, maybe 2%. All right? So when we go back to 2019, that's how we could grow 1.75% and have a 3.5% unemployment rate. And if people say it's the greatest economy in the history of the country, it wasn't, but it felt pretty good. Okay, so then I don't need to tell you, good so far? You with me so far? So then we get into 2020, I don't need to tell you what happened in 2020, I'd like to forget it. COVID hit, we contracted 30% in March, we rebounded 30% in April, But that left us with an 8 or 9% hold. And what we did at the Fed, along with the administration, is try to estimate the GDP gap. So let's say the economy is $23 trillion, plus or minus, we're going to have an 8 or 9 or 10% drop due to COVID. All right, $2 trillion. The administration passed the CARES Act, which was about $2 trillion. Okay, and at the Fed, we dropped rates to zero, and we started buying every single month $80 billion of treasuries and $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities. And that's a long-winded way of saying we basically printed the money. That's how we print. We take money and we buy those bonds, and we monetized all that spending. And if you ask me today to give a grade to the Fed and the administration, not perfect, but by and large, we did about what we should do. We obviously had a bunch of programs called 13-3 programs that backstop the muni market, the debt market, a number of other markets to restore market function. Those got canceled at the end of 2020. But I'd say so far so good. The problems we're dealing with today, in my opinion, started ironically toward the end of 2020. Okay, so here's what happened. First, the Fed committed to keeping rates at zero until we got back to full employment. I dissented, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. And it committed to continuing to buy bonds at $80 billion of treasuries and $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities. You then had a new administration that passed a new piece of legislation. Remember American Rescue Act? Remember that one? It was passed in 21. Anybody ring a bell? It was another $1.9 trillion. That was not intended to fill the COVID gap. That was spending over and above, in my opinion, what was probably needed for COVID. Maybe that could have been $500 billion, but it was $1.9 trillion. It ran through the budget deficit in 2021, which for those of you who watched is why we had a $3 trillion budget deficit in 2021. All right? Already went through the deficit. Okay, what happened in 2021 is with all this spending that was going on, what was nominal GDP growth in 2021? Anybody want to take a guess? I told you what it was in 19, it was 3.5%, and that was a great economy. Nominal GDP, I was in the suspense. Nominal GDP growth in 2021 was 12%. Okay? And for those, and some of you do who watch me on TV in early 21, this is why my team was telling me, this is crazy. We're printing too much and we're spending too much. And we're going to overheat the economy. And that's why people like me were talking about, we got to stop buying these bonds. But we overstimulated fiscally and monetarily, and we grew at 12%. We get into 2022, what happened? We passed two more critical pieces of legislation that we're dealing with today. The Inflation Reduction Act, another $1 trillion. Although the latest reports I see is it's already $400 or $500 billion over budget, so maybe that's going to be $1.5 trillion. And one more, the bipartisan, which means you got votes on both sides, Infrastructure Act, another $1 trillion. All right. So now we're up to $6 trillion. CARES 1.9, ARPA 1.9. Inflation Reduction Act over one, Infrastructure Act another, and the COVID gap I told you was about 2. We were to the point where in 2021 and 22 we had higher GDP growth than we would have had, and absolute GDP got to a spot, goods purchasing got to a spot, was by our estimate 10% higher than it would have been if COVID never happened. All right? So we overheated the economy because of fiscal and monetary spending. We don't need to cry over it because it's done. Okay, but then you get into 2022, and the Fed recognized that this excess spending was creating inflation, which was not transitory. And the Fed did a 180. It stopped buying $80 billion of treasuries and $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities a month, and eventually completely stopped by September and started to run off the balance sheet, and started raising rates as Tom went through up to 5.25, 5.5. Now, that would be called in the lingo as slamming on the brakes. So what we did during 21 and 22 in the United States is run 120 miles an hour. Overdid it. and the right thing to do with an intersection coming is slam on the brakes. And we're in the middle right now of that slam. All right? That's what's going on right now. So that's part one. So now let's get to where we are now. So if you had asked people a year or two ago to predict what the economy would have done if you raised rates this fast, I think most people would predict that you're going to have a recession. And by the way, what's such a big deal about 5.25%, 5? I remember when I was younger, rates were higher. Well, remember, when rates were a lot higher when we were younger, workforce growth was more like 3%, not 0%. And so the potential growth rate of the U.S. economy was more like 4 or 5%, not 1.5 to 2%. So rates were higher, but it's because growth was higher. And the number one determinant of interest rates are prospects for future growth. And future growth prospects, because of demographics, I think, are sluggish. Okay? And so most people thought we'd be in a recession by now. So why the heck aren't we? And I'll give you my own view as to why we're not. Nobody knows exactly, but I'll give you my view. 3 reasons, 3 pieces. The money, that ARPA money, that $1.9 trillion I talked about, it got distributed to the states in 2021. It didn't get spent, a lot of it, by the states. The states stockpiled the money. If you look at treasury holdings in state and local governments around the country, you see they're up $750 billion from pre-COVID. A lot of this is the unspent ARPA money. And that money is right now in the process of being spent by state and local governments. Some of it has to be spent by the end of, it has to be obligated by the end of 24 and spent by the end of 25, or they lose it. And I can tell you about a bunch of projects that are being started around the country that are being rushed, because if they don't spend the money, they're going to lose that ARPA money. Literally, either spend it or you lose it. All right? That's happening now. Not being talked about. And if you want to look for it in the deficit, you won't find it. Already went through the deficit in 2021. A second, there are hundreds of billions of dollars at this point of manufacturing projects being fueled by the Inflation Reduction Act. So what's that? I'm from Kansas. Kansas is building a $4 billion. Anybody heard of Kansas, by the way? All right. So DeSoto is building a $4 billion, just got announced, a $4 billion battery manufacturing plant. 25% of it is money from the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay? Now, if you live in Kansas, you probably know about that project. If you don't live in Kansas, you're not paying any attention to it. But Kansas has a 2.9% unemployment rate today. It will take 20,000 workers to either build that plant or staff that plant. Kansas only has 40,000 people who identify as unemployed. So they ain't getting them from the unemployed. People are going to have to switch jobs or move to the state. The issue is these plants are being built all over the country. Okay? There's at least 16 of them that I can identify in Kentucky, Georgia, Kansas, several states. And there's a whole bunch of other projects. Again, usually 25% of the money is from the Inflation Reduction Act that are being built all over the country. The administration keeps track of how many new manufacturing projects have been announced in the last 24 months, and the total, according to them, is near $500 billion. Okay? So while business is weak in a lot of areas, and many industries feel like they're in a recession, if you're on the receiving end of the Inflation Reduction Act money, either electric car, vehicle plants, battery manufacturing plants, semiconductors, through the CHIPS Act, doesn't matter what interest rates are, that money's getting spent, and businesses will partner because it's a good deal. Okay, so we have a dramatic amount of spending going on that, and the infrastructure bill is already spent. There's already been $300 billion of projects announced nationwide for the infrastructure bill. So my own view is, to get to the point, I think if you didn't have the unspent ARPA money, you didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act money, and you didn't have the Infrastructure Act money, I think the Fed would have quit raising rates, probably at 4.5%, might have got as high as 4 3/4, I don't know, wouldn't have gotten this high, okay? And where are we gonna go now? My concern is, we were talking about this at lunch, This spending is continuing, and it will continue all of this year, all of next year, okay, between those three sources. And so I don't think those people who've been saying for a while, going to have a recession, I've been saying for last year, we're not going to have a recession. How can you? You may have a bunch of industries that feel like they're in a recession and are very weak. Manufacturing in this country, for example, is very weak. But what happens is when you're spending this kind of dough spread across the country, it not only goes into the project, but it goes into the service sector. And workers, the unemployment rate stays low. Workers have plenty of money in their pockets. They have dinner and they want to do all sorts of stuff. And even though a lot of the COVID savings is being spent, this spending continues. So I don't think we're going to have, I don't know, obviously I don't know, you never know about these things. I doubt we're going to have a recession in 23 and 24. It may feel like a recession, depending on the industry, and because the size of the spending. The problem with this is the Fed, I think, is either close to or done raising rates, but they're trying to figure out why is the economy so strong and maybe we haven't raised rates enough. You hear some Fed personnel saying maybe we haven't raised rates enough, maybe we haven't kept them high enough for long enough. And I don't think that's the reason. I think you have two competing forces. You have the monetary policy tightening and you have the fiscal policy. This is the type of spending you would do after a recession. Okay, this is what you do to motor out of a recession, but we're doing it pre-recession, and so we're not going into a recession, in my opinion, because of it. The cost of it is going to be the Fed funds rate at 5.25%, 5.5%. I still think even with all this, it's not going to go higher, but it may stay here it will stay here for longer than it would have otherwise. And how long will that be? That truth is nobody knows. Jay Powell doesn't know, nobody knows. It wouldn't shock me if it stays at this level until the middle of next year, but I don't know. Okay? But I think people are going to be surprised at the resiliency of the economy because of all this spending. And the last comment I would make is, so that's the Fed, that's the story of the Fed. For those of you who are waiting for the Fed funds rate to come down, I think you're going to have to wait a little longer. And I know you guys are we're talking a bunch, you're very sensitive on bridge loans to the Fed funds rate. It'll come, the good news is, about 2 years from now, I'm confident that the appropriate Fed funds rate for the organic growth of this economy is probably 2.5% to 3%. Okay, it's definitely not 5.25% and 5.5%. And for those who think it is, I think it's being distorted, their thinking, by all this government spending. This government money will eventually slow down, and we will be back down to 2.5%, 3% on the Fed funds rate. The problem is I don't know when, and it may not be start to go down. I don't know until the middle of next year, but obviously that's going to be month to month, and I'll change my mind on that along with everyone else. There's one other thing going on that's happened as a result of all this spending. Pre-COVID, government, and I know there's no alcohol at lunch, so if this is depressing you, I'm sorry, I'm curious to serve. Pre-COVID, government debt held by the public was 70% of GDP, okay? And by the way, people like me were getting up on TV and saying, it's unsustainable, we can't sustain this. And the present value of unfunded entitlements was something like 60 trillion. Today, government debt held by the public is over 100% of GDP, okay? Because we spent so much money. Remember, even just the 6 trillion I just talked to you about, that alone is close to 30% of GDP we spent in the aftermath of COVID. Part of it on COVID, I would argue 10% on COVID, 20% because we wanted to, okay? And so, and the present value of unfunded entitlements is now $75 trillion. So there's one other thing going on, which I watch carefully, and it's got me more scared than what the Fed's going to do, and that's what's going on with the 5-year and 10-year. And for those of you who are thinking about terming out, you notice that the 10-year Treasury just quietly inched up from like 375 to 4. This morning, right before I came on, it's 426 now. Okay, so why is that happening? A lot of people say, well, the economy's so strong. I don't think so. The Fed's going to stay higher for longer. I don't think so. I think one of the reasons why rates are backing up is we've got now, the talk is we were going to run $1.5 trillion deficit in 2023, and now the new estimates are closer to $2 trillion. That's over 8% of GDP, probably the highest pre-recession deficit we've run in our lifetimes, in our lifetimes. And the CDO projects that we're heading into the twos on our way to 3, and that means there's an enormous amount of supply of debt coming. The Fed is running out its balance sheet, so the Fed's not going to buy it. The banks did buy it, and that didn't work out very well. We heard about the bank problems, so they're not buying it. Japan is starting to reverse yield curve control. They're not buying it. And I think the curve is backing up because people are starting to realize, let's say the Fed funds rate does get down to 3%, for example. A typical term premium might be 150 basis points. That's 450. I think people are starting to think out there in the markets, maybe fair value for the 10 years, not 4.25, maybe it's 450. In other words, we could back up more. That backing up at the long end is a tightening in addition to what the Fed's doing, and I think it's worth watching very carefully. Okay, so that's the spiel. We're sort of in the middle phase right now where I don't know that rates are going to go up, but they're going to stay here for the next number of months until the Fed is convinced that inflation is not going to reignite. My guess is that'll be sometime in first quarter, second quarter of next year, but I don't know. We'll have to see. And then you will see the Fed start to whittle it down gradually, but they're not going to whittle it down below probably 2.5%, 3%. And I think that'll be a great relief, I know, in your industry and others. My concern is we're coming out of this very highly leveraged. If we needed fiscal stimulus, or we need it when this government money starts to run out here, we need it in 25 and 26. We don't have a lot of capacity for fiscal stimulus. And the Fed balance sheet, even with the runoff, is up to $8 trillion. And so my concern is we might have been better off allowing ourselves to have a recession here and not spend all this money and save it for when we needed it. But it is what it is. But I think you should be prepared that I don't think you're going to see a hockey stick with reignited growth either. But I don't think we're going to have a recession next year or two. I think it may feel like a double headache, though. Okay, last comment, and then I'm going to take your questions. Does it all make sense? That's kind of where we are. Okay, so I mentioned 2 or 3 things I'd take from this. For inflation to get down to 2%, nominal GDP growth, in my view, probably has to get to 4. Okay, and that's what I'm watching every month. Okay, and why do I say 4? I'm telling you, I don't think the U.S. economy has the potential to grow faster on a real basis at the upside 2%. So it tells you if nominal GDP growth is running at 7 or 8%, it tells you 4 or 5% of that is inflation. So I think nominal growth, that's what pays the bills, is going to drift down a little bit more. Nominal growth right this moment as we're sitting here, let's say real GDP growth this year is running at 2, the inflation rate's running 3.5 to 4, we're at 5.5 to 6, we're almost there, but we have to weaken. The U.S. economy probably has to weaken a little further. So the number one advice, watch nominal GDP, okay? Second piece of advice is most of what you're seeing on TV is interesting, but I'd call it the bouncing ball. The world loves data. It loves cyclical stuff. Jobs report, employment report, China's weak. 1 week, next week they're strong, now they're weak. But the real world doesn't work that way. But it gets reported like it's a sporting event, okay? Where the PMI is here, and over because of the 10th, the market freaks out, and I call that the bouncing ball. Somebody asked me, what's the most intelligent advice you can give to somebody if you want to be a good investor? And I can't believe I'm giving this because I've preached the opposite for so many years. Stop watching CNBC and Bloomberg so carefully and read the Wall Street Journal, but not too carefully, because it will confuse you. I get confused because they report on cyclical stuff and instead what I watch, and when I was at the Dallas Fed for 6 years, I trained my team, there are 5 structural drivers that drive the economy. That helps explain, I think, much more what's going on, and I would watch those. Here's what they are, and I've already mentioned economy. Number one, I already mentioned aging. Demographics is the most important driver in this economy. And by the way, we shouldn't feel bad. We're aging here, but so is Japan, so is Germany. China's got a worse aging problem than we do. Their average age of their workforce is higher than ours. That's why their growth is slowing. They've masked it with all this investment spending. That if your workforce growth is decelerating like it is in the United States, Japan, Germany, China, growth is going to slow. Okay, so watch demographics, and when you hear an immigration debate, legal immigration debate, keep it in mind that we actually need workers. The problem in the next 20 years is not going to be that we've got too many workers, in my opinion. It's going to be we don't have enough, okay? And I think it's taken us a while to get our arms around that. That's number one. Number two driver, globalization has been a disinflationary force for most of our lives. And up to 2019, it absolutely was. Meaning, if you had a cheaper way to do something, either labor, goods, materials, elsewhere in the world, you did it. Okay. And what we did in the United States, if it was surviving here in the US, it had to be globally competitive. All right? We've now changed that a bit, and I would call this deglobalization. And now we want certain things, we want reshored here. Okay, and I think to some extent, some of those things make a lot of sense. You know, we went through in COVID going, oh my God, wouldn't it be better if we made masks here? Yes, we don't make any semiconductors here. But we went for 50 years, we never made semiconductors here. And we realized, okay, we want to build some semiconductors here. We should build battery plants here. My worry is when I say deglobalization, this trend may have gone to an extreme one way, it's going to extreme now the other way, in that we might be building things here that are no longer globally competitive. If you build a battery plant that produces a battery that costs twice as much as you could import it, you know, we had steel industry once upon a time that was not globally competitive, and it's painful to go through that. And so I'd be watching carefully whether this pendulum of globalization to deglobalization, it might need to swing back, especially in a world where we don't have enough workers. If you want to do everything here, it's expensive as hell, okay? And we don't, and we took for granted that prices were lower because we were more global. Maybe that was too far one end, but maybe we've gone too far the other. I've watched that. Second big driver. Third big driver, the energy transition. All right, so we hear about it every day. I co-chaired the greenhouse gas emissions task force for Harvard for 10 years, for the whole university, with a physics professor. So I believe in the energy transition, except the UN plan is not a realistic plan. It suggests that we can make this transition from fossil fuels to alternatives in 10 years, and we can't. And I live in Texas, so I talk to energy producers all the time. We probably are 5 years away from peak oil demand, which means people around the world are burning more and more fossil fuels. The energy, no matter how much money we spend, including government money, on wind, solar, other stuff, there's a gap. Oil prices, if you haven't noticed, I bet you have jumped from whatever they were in the 50s to the 80s, and they're going up further, and we are very vulnerable over the next number of years to being undersupplied. If there's a radical price move, I think it's going to be to the upside. There are 50 million workers in this country that make $50,000 a year or less. They could make ends meet in 2019. Not perfect, but they were getting by. They cannot make ends meet today. And the reason, and that's why this inflation is so pernicious: food, rent, energy, and God forbid, healthcare. Energy is key to those workers being able to make ends meet. They don't have access to mass transit, and they even have to drive to work. And so my only comment on the energy transition, I think, again, the pendulum has swung. For us, if you want a cleaner environment, you want to burn less coal, we would be producing 3 million more barrels a day in the United States now. We're the cleanest producer in the world, okay? Instead, we're limiting U.S. fossil fuel production, encouraging Soviet Union, Russia, I should say, and Saudi Arabia, Venezuela produce more. Farther doesn't make any sense. And I'm a pro for this transition that has to be done not on the backs of $50,000 a year workers in poor countries. You want a cleaner environment, you want to get inflation down, produce more. I think this is a strategic error, and I think it's worth watching. Okay, last two, and I'll take questions. Technology-enabled disruption, AI, all that stuff, we hear about it every day. I think is a great, a lot of people think it's a threat. I think it's a great, there's a strike going on in Hollywood, part of it's over at AI. I think it's a fantastic development in terms of disinflation. It's disinflationary, except the problem with technology and technology-enabled disruption and AI is it will require all of us to be more adaptable and have to change jobs more often. I spent 10 years doing blank, and technology might very well. I'm a call center worker, job's gone. I'm a driver, I drive for a living. Technology will ultimately mean that millions of jobs will be gone. Okay? And this is worth watching. There will be plenty of jobs. We will not have a problem with jobs, but right now we're struggling with it already. Literacy will be at a premium. People will have to change jobs and get retrained in the middle period more often. Easier to say than to do. And right now, educational attainment in the United States is lagging the rest of the world. High school graduation rates are deteriorating. Attendance at high schools is deteriorating. Why? Because these kids are bums? No, they're working to help their families make ends meet. Okay? And so we have a real problem. The technology investment, we got that part done. The part we're not investing in is early childhood literacy, affordable childcare that reads the kids, secondary education, skills training, the whole ecosystem. We have to dramatically, I would be happier if we took some of the government money we're spending on infrastructure and spent it on education, on our human capital. That's how we're going to get the most out of AI and technology and get this productivity boost. Right now, we're going the wrong way on educational attainment. So that's why I say to everywhere I go, if you can get involved in local reading to kids during their lunch hour, skills training, helping with education in your local community, do it. It's the most important, for me, it's the most important thing I can do philanthropically and with my volunteer time. So that's a fourth one. I've watched that. It's a problem. And then the fifth, which we've already talked about, we're at the end of the debt super cycle, in my opinion. And what's a fancified way of saying, through our entire life, when some knucklehead like me got up and talked to a group like you, people say, yeah, whiny, concerning. We'll just cut taxes and we'll spend more money. And I hate to say, and we did. We did. It's the way we've dealt with every problem, including COVID, except we overdid it for COVID. But now we're over 100% debt to GDP in an aging society. And I don't know that we have the dry powder anymore to either cut taxes or keep spending. We may have to get back to basics. I think we will, which is where I started this. Grow the workforce, improve productivity. That is how we're going to have to grow GDP from here. Leveraging up and financial gimmickry isn't going to cut it. Now, last for all of you, why don't I go around and I talk to businesses every day? I just give talks like this to groups. The only reason I mention what I'm mentioning is if you're about to leverage up, and make some big bet because you think rates are about to, because you read it, or at least sit on TV, rates are about to get cut, I would just say I would prioritize survival first. And I don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to tell you for sure. Whatever I say today, I don't know. But I do know you need a balanced risk. Make sure you run a downside scenario where rates stay higher for longer, the economy is more sluggish for longer, and just make sure you can get through that business cycle. Because if you survive, you're going to do fine. But if you take undue risks in here, this would not be a period, in my opinion, to be taking undue risks, especially in terms of leverage. I think this is a time to make sure you prioritize getting through this period. We'll get to a better environment. but it may take a little longer than people think, and it may be a little longer than a year, maybe a couple of years. Certainly from a rates point of view. All right, so let me stop there. Let's go to your questions.
So a big part of our business is people moving, and you're saying that rates are going to stay higher for longer?
Let's do it with the mic, sir.
Thank you. Big part of our business.
Big part of your business is moving.
Yeah, and you're saying the rates are going to stay higher for longer.
I would say this. Let's run scenarios. There's a scenario where the environment's going to be, the economy's going to be a lot weaker, and I'm just wrong. In which case, I can tell you the Fed funds rate is going to come down faster. But my base case is, I think you're going to have a Fed funds rate that's higher into the middle of next year, and you may not get relief until the back half of next year.
But my point is, a lot of these people have got their mortgages at 3%. They're not going to move until there's a better rate. So when do you see things declining to the point where we see more movement in the housing market?
Well, listen, if you've got a low rate mortgage, I think people are thanking their lucky stars. We also have a housing supply problem depending on the state. Can't produce enough materials, labor, and so that's also negatively impacting people moving. There's a lot of people going into multifamily though right now. It's kind of a holding pattern. And so you got a big pool of people who could buy homes in the future and move. But I would guess I think this stagnant period is going to last for a while, because I think that 3 and 4% mortgage look pretty damn good. And my worry is, even if the Fed, this is my worry, even if the Fed cuts rates, I could make an argument that the 10-year Treasury at 4.25%, 4.5%, maybe it doesn't go down a lot. Everybody's assuming, it's going to go down when the Fed starts cutting. I don't know about that. I think it's very possible that it could be stickier, in which case, the world will adjust. We were talking at lunch. It always does. If it turns out the prevailing mortgage rate is 7%, miraculously people will get used to it. They will talk about their parents used to have the way I used to talk about my parents used to have a 4 to 5%, and they'll adjust and they'll try to buy a house. But prices may have to give. Prices may get a little lower. We'll get to a new equilibrium. We always do, and we will here.
Thank you.
You just have to. You may have to be more patient than you've been accustomed. How's that? That's what I'm warning about.
You had mentioned being at the end of the debt super cycle. Our debt equity ratio, debt to GDP is around unfunded is twice that now. I'm going to ask the really ugly question.
How do you get out of it?
Does that mean that the U.S. is going to default?
No. So I think what's going to have to happen, if you want to improve our debt to equity ratio, so to speak, as you talk about this, it's going to be not one thing, it'll be a puzzle. Let me give you what the piece of the puzzle. In the long run pocket, you're going to have a national discussion about legal immigration. Imagine that, how well is that going to go over? But we need to grow the workforce. If you grow a little faster, that helps you fit into that. We're going to have to invest more in education, early childhood literacy, skills training, and the other thing, I would guess we're going to need some tightening of the belt. The next president in 2025, I don't care what party they're in, is going to have to face very large deficits, and there's going to be more of a national discussion. We have a debt problem. We're going to have to control spending by discussion about taxes. It'll take 10 things, but you can't just cut your way out of this. We're going to have to find ways to grow the workforce and improve productivity in addition, and we'll then grow into it, and I'm confident we can. The part I don't like is we're not talking about it. You know what I mean? I learned as a business person, and you know this too, you can solve any problem. You may fail, but it starts with laying it out. I don't see anybody laying it out. Do you? That's what worries me. Which is why I'm trying to flag it, but we need to lay it out, and I'm very confident we lay it out and do something about it. Yes.
So, you didn't mention Fox earlier, you said CNBC and the others, but I have
Fox, so you watch Fox all day long.
My business partner would tell you that he's got Fox at every channel in his whole house, and he keeps talking about the rates are going to continue to go up. And
yes.
really anxious about seeing, 10, 12, 13% interest
Oh my
rates.
God.
Right? And you
You should
are,
stop. Tell them to stop watching Fox.
well, I've been telling you.
I don't think that's.
So do you think, so I'm hearing from you that it's, you think they're going to be flat the whole
Don't use the word guarantee.
Yeah, I didn't say guarantee, so no. But 1 to 2 years, what I'm hearing from you. What do you believe are the opportunities?
Let me give you the building blocks, the yield curve. And I'll speak, I'm not even an economist, so I can speak as a layman. Let's say the real growth rate in the U.S. economy, real, is 1.5 to 2. Okay? Let's say inflation, we finally get it down to 2. All right? And if you're at the Fed, if I'm at the Fed, I'm going to want a neutral rate, and we're either accommodative or restrictive. Somewhere in the neighborhood of say 3.5%. Would strike me about in the stretch some of those facts. But then you got to add 150 basis points for the 10-year. And by the way, if we're looking a little bit more over leveraged, too highly leveraged the rest of the world, and people are stressed for liquidity, maybe they'll charge another 25. So yeah, I think there's downside risks to get to the 5s. I wouldn't bet on my life on it, but are we heading a lot higher than that? I don't see how we could, and here's why. I get back to where I started. The number one driver of interest rates globally is prospects for future growth, and I can tell you because of the aging prospects for future growth around the world are the housing. All right. So no, I don't see rates going like this, at least for governments, unless there's a credit issue. But that shouldn't happen because future prospects for future growth are very mediocre, worse than been in my lifetime. It's not the end of the world, but that's why rates have been low. People think it's been distorted, and yeah, there's been a little bit of that. But the reason rates globally have been so low is because of demographics. Those demographic issues are not getting better. If anything, they're getting a little worse. And so that's why the rates today are really high relative to those growth prospects. But it's been necessary because we so overheated in response in the aftermath of COVID. But we won't stay here. This is not a natural place to stay. 5.25, 5.5. I see some people from the Fed and others on TV saying, well, maybe the neutral rate is much higher. Look at the structural drivers, and I think they'll change their mind. Okay? Yes. Please.
Hi. So I've been reading about the meeting of the BRICS countries recently, and I was curious if you think there's any cause for concern of other countries moving away from the U.S. dollar, or the U.S. dollar kind of using or losing its hold.
So there's good news and there's bad news. Anytime you see the BRICS talking to each other and saying, let's denominate these purchases away from the dollar. And Saudi is not a great actor in this either. They're happy to start denominating purchases away from the dollar. Not so great. Okay. Then you look at, so that's we should be concerned about that. On the other hand, China is, so what are the alternatives to the dollar? I don't think it's Bitcoin. I mean, gold, Bitcoin, and unfortunately for China, China's having a hell of a big problem right now because of their demographic issues, and they're 20 years away from making the reforms in terms of convertibility, exchange. You'd be afraid to keep a lot of your money in the yuan, with good reason. And so, fortunately for us, for all the mistakes we may have made, we look pretty good relative to the rest of the world, and I don't see a viable alternative to the dollar for the next 20 years. That doesn't mean we won't have to pay more for our debt, though. Okay? But will we still be the world's reserve currency? I think we've got a hell of a chance, especially if we get our house in order. Now, what would be a wild card? Technology or some development that can't even comprehend, which is possible in this world, that just makes it so people can own something away from the dollar. But I don't see it yet. But is that something to worry you about the BRICS? Yeah, we should be worried. We're relying so heavily right now on the dollar being the world's reserve currency. We're breaking every rule we would insist on. We'd be lecturing another country if they did the stuff we're doing. And so we should stop relying so heavily on it. I think we'd be a lot better off. Yes.
about a year before inflation started to kick into high gears and reach the 40-year high. I remember Larry Summers, former Obama Treasury Secretary, warned the Biden administration that was going to happen if they kept the stimulus spending at that rate. I believe you were voice of the Fed warning against that.
That's when I dissented at the same time, and he and I compared notes at the time.
So how did the administration and the Fed get it so wrong by saying that inflation was going to be transitory? And when in our history has something like this happened where inflation's hit a 40-year high, and yet economic policy hasn't adjusted at all to try to...
Well, we adjusted, we just were late. We're 20 months late.
I'm talking about the administration, not the Fed.
So this is, you probably had a confluence of factors. You had a new administration. So this is, I talked about 5 drivers. One of the 5 is the energy transition. And I think, I'm not saying it's bad or good. I can see some good in it. This administration wanted badly to use this opportunity to jumpstart and expedite the conversion to electric cars, wind, solar, because they felt, I think they really did legitimately feel it was an existential threat to the country. And they used the Inflation Reduction Act to do that. I think the big boo-boo, for lack of a better word, the American Rescue Act should have been something like $500 billion, maybe. How it got to $1.9 trillion, again, you have a new administration, you have one party controlling, I think, both houses of Congress, and they barely passed it. And no offense to anybody, but yeah, that was, if you'd like a do-over, I'd take a do-over on that one. It was too big. And Larry Summers, to his credit, called it out. It's way too big, and it was too big. And how do people miss it? Listen, we've had other, I don't want to cite them, but I just reel them off here. But I can think of 3 or 4 other little mistakes like that where we went into another country and thought one thing was the case and we missed it. And, we made mistakes. We are capable of making mistakes. What you hope for in a country is that you'll have an open debate. You hope the media will play a constructive role in framing the debate, which maybe it's not, it's too balkanized. And we will be able to bat this around. We fail to have that debate. And that happens often in the aftermath of crises or during crises where you can pass anything. As they say, anything get done and maybe it is not. But they'd ideally love to go fix it. So I've said publicly, I would love to take the unspent ARPA money and tell the states you got another 5 years before you have to spend it. Okay, I've run out of time here. But we can still fix this if you recognize it. It's not too late to fix this. Or spread out the timing on these, Inflation Reduction Act on infrastructure. Spread it out. I mean, I would love to see, we're going to need that money and we'll need those projects, particularly if we have a recession, which we will eventually. Blah, blah. Okay, what else? How are we doing on time?
I was wondering what impacts you thought the continuing collapse of the office market, regional malls, and maybe even some additional bank failures might have on rates in the next 12, 24 months.
So let's do them in reverse order. I can tell you on the ground, and you guys are close to this, so you see it. If you're a small business today, good luck. It's really hard to either get a loan or maintain your loan. And the reason is banks, and I'm in a lot of bank boardrooms giving advice to bank CEOs and their boards. They are worried about further deposit loss. They're worried about repricing of the deposits. They're worried that we're about to head into a credit cycle. And better yet, depending on their size, you've got a new raft of capital requirements that are coming at them. It's hard to get a loan. So I think that won't affect so much the risk-free rate, but I would guess the spread is already wider. You know what I mean? I would guess the spread is already wider because of what's going on. So the risk is being repriced. Maybe risk was improperly priced before. It's getting repriced now. And I think, again, if you're not over leveraged and if you have dry powder, it's going to be an environment where there's a great opportunity. But this is a time where you want to have some dry powder. And I think the bank situation is likely to get worse before it gets better, by the way. And this treasury backup does not help because it comes right out of book value of their capital, or market value of their capital, which they have mismarked because of this accounting fiction, holding maturity. So, all right, yes, sir.
I think a lot of people would love to get an understanding, some insight about how an administration and the Fed works together.
Okay. So let me make you one thing, because I always get this afterwards. If you want to learn more, I do videos on YouTube, free, it's not for money, on YouTube, where I talk about these subjects. Just go to Robert Stephen Kaplan YouTube channel, and you can watch. I do a whole podcast. I used to teach leadership, and I do a bunch of things on leadership, and I do a bunch of things, put them out every couple weeks on the economy. So if you want to watch that, feel free to do that. So how does the Fed and the administration work together? In normal times, there's a lot of independence, and other than occasional conversation between the Treasury Secretary and the chair of the Fed, they don't talk at all. And I think the Fed's philosophy, Jay Powell said, we take fiscal policy as a given. He doesn't feel it's his right. Other chairs have felt differently. His right to comment on it. I probably don't totally agree with that approach, but that's the way he's approached it. And we're independent. In a crisis, all of a sudden you come together and you start coordinating very carefully. Witness what we did to fill the COVID gap in 2020. But in periods like this, I think Jay's philosophy is we have no say. I don't even want to comment on fiscal policy. I mean, Greenspan and Bernanke and others, I think, were more vocal and more willing to comment on it. So, for example, if they think the government's overspending, they might call it out. He's not going to do that. He's just going to say, I'm going to take the hand I'm dealt, and we're going to play that hand, and we're going to do it through the Fed balance sheet, through interest rates. And that's what you should expect from Jay for the remainder of certainly his term.
You still have people at the Fed, though, that are maybe more political, with you and others who try to help the administration?
When I was at the Fed, I was pretty local, but if an administration official contacted me, I'd be super careful about having any conversations. I would speak with elected officials on both sides of the aisle, but very transparently, and at the Fed, you're really careful talking what would seem like in a coordinated way with the administration. I was really careful about that.
Okay, before we move on, and before we let Robert run off, I want to point out something. When we want to have impressive speakers like Robert Kaplan, we do offer fees, right? Speaker fees. But I